Andre Carson.
My brother from another mother. So good to see you, sir. Chairman.
My man, Denzel Washington says in Training Day, my man.
My man, my man. You already know. Good to see you, dear brother. I'm
It's
trying
good
to
see
get
you,
my
brother.
situation right. Here we are. Here we are. Here we are. There we go.
Yes, sir. How's everything in Indianapolis?
You know, we have our mayor and governor, and of course the delegation. We're working with our public health officials, our state legislators, our city councilors. So we're practicing social distancing. We've had, unfortunately, a few deaths statewide and a few in my district, and we've had many infected. But especially in the urban centers and in the densely populated parts like Indianapolis and up north in Gary and Fort Wayne and Evansville. But unlike Brooklyn, which has a greater population, I know you guys have been navigating a lot. And we appreciate your leadership, dear brother.
No, I appreciate that, brother. You know, the challenge that we have here in Brooklyn is that we've got 2.7 million people in the borough alone.
Wow.
And so, as a borough, if we were a city, we'd be the fourth largest city in the United States of America. And as you know, the density challenge is one that's significant
Sure.
because we're very close proximity to each other is part of what makes Brooklyn special, with a lot of kinetic energy. But in the context of a pandemic, it creates particular concern, which is why, you know, we continue to urge everybody to practice social distancing. This virus can impact everybody. I know initially there were some theories circulating on the net that African Americans were immune somehow to COVID-19.
Sure.
And that was irresponsible rhetoric that was propagated, and lives have been lost as a result. And so we have to make sure, as you've been doing, and you've been leading the charge, my brother, and making sure everybody understands this is a virus that impacts everybody, regardless of race or region or religion.
I agree. That's such a phenomenal point. You know, I saw some of those reports, and as much as you and I both appreciate coming from the African American tradition and our wonderful melanin, unfortunately, we too are afflicted with this. And as you know, Chairman, there are a lot of underlying health issues that we have and systemic issues that make us much more vulnerable. You talk about institutional racism. You talk about the lack of having access to care. You talk about folks with hypertension, folks with high cholesterol, folks with asthma, folks with diabetes, all struggling with their existing conditions while trying to fight COVID is a tough challenge. You know, I unfortunately lost a cousin last week to COVID. He was 64 years old. 2 days later, Chair, his mom passed away. So this thing hits home, and I pray that under your leadership and the leadership of the Democratic Party and the rest of us who are fighting on the ground, we can get the message out as we work on this CARES 2 package, which we've been talking about how heavy it is in terms of infrastructure. But what are your thoughts, Chair, in terms of other things that people may want to know that you're working on, boss?
Yeah, well, I think it's important coming out of CARES 1, which was $2.2 trillion relief bill that you worked on, we worked on together, and we were able to pass with tremendous leadership from Speaker Pelosi and the House Democratic Caucus, working with our friends in the Senate, as well as the administration and folks on the other side of the aisle, that those direct payments are beginning to hit this week. And that's important. And those who already have direct deposit information on file should have already received or will be receiving that $1,200 direct payment assistance. If you are an individual who makes up to $75,000, and of course, if you are a married couple, you'll receive $2,400 in your direct deposit account as long as you make up to, but not more than, $150,000. For those who have not traditionally received a refund from the IRS or traditionally filed taxes via mail, as you have been doing, it's important to communicate that you can speed up the receipt of your direct assistance, if you go to irs.gov and then look for the portal that applies to non-filers, provide your direct deposit information, and you will accelerate the receipt of your check. And that's very important, I think, for all of our folks to understand and to take advantage of that opportunity, which we all put to make happen.
No, that's so brilliant. Chairman, what are your folks saying who happen to be small business owners who may not have 500 employees, who may only have 2 or 3 employees, or who may be self-employed, who may be an esthetician, or who may be some of our friends in the entertainment industry? What are your thoughts in terms of the questions that they ask as it relates to coverage?
Yeah, this is the big piece. And so we authorized $349 billion in the context of the Paycheck Protection Program to make sure that small businesses, individuals, or companies that have 500 or less employees can receive assistance to make it through this storm. Now, that spans a wide range. You've got mom and pop shops at the lower end of that range. You just articulated that, Andre. And then you've got companies with hundreds of employees, medium-sized companies that traditionally have the pre-existing relationship with financial institutions. And one of the things that we found is that many of our women-owned businesses, our minority-owned businesses, our mom and pop shops, our smaller veterans-owned businesses are having a more difficult time accessing the relief from the Paycheck Protection Program. And that's why, though Mitch McConnell went to the floor of the Senate last week and indicated that he wanted to pass an additional $250 billion for the Small Business Administration through unanimous consent, we objected because our view was, yes, that additional funding is needed, but they got to be guardrails.
Sure.
We have to make sure that funds are set aside for the businesses, the mom and pop shops, the women-owned businesses, the minority-owned businesses that are on our commercial corridors. I mean, you go to any traditionally African-American neighborhood in the country, you're going to find an MLK Boulevard.
Absolutely.
Help the businesses on MLK Boulevard.
Come on, absolutely.
I mean, nobody should be mad at that. So we want to ensure that there are guardrails that are in place in that regard. And that's one of the things that we're fighting for in the context of the legislation. We've said of the 250, you need to set aside 125 billion for community development financial institutions that feel confident can get the money. One question for you. You serve on the Intel committee, and I think for a significant period of time, people have been concerned that a global pandemic could present real challenges to the health and well-being of the American people and to national security. Can you speak a little bit about what we need to do moving forward to be better prepared for the consequences of this type of pandemic?
That's a phenomenal question. You know, one of the things that we're wrestling with in the intelligence space is how can we hold public forums and, of course, private forums and work with public health officials in preemptively sifting through these viruses or pandemics in a way that protects our national security, but also informs our hospitals, informs our healthcare leaders in a way that doesn't alarm the system, but in a way that at least gives us some comfort. Because on one end, you always have threats from other countries, and as our technological environment is changing very rapidly, our defense environment is changing very rapidly, we know that we're no longer fighting in the same way with thousands of soldiers. We're fighting through drone usage. We're fighting through biological warfare. And so this raises additional questions about how do we vote? How do we vote on these important legislative matters? Do we look at online voting as a way to resolve these issues? And I'll leave it up to bright attorneys like yourself to sift through it. But what keeps me up at night, Brother Hakeem, is the encryption issue. So we want to have a system that is encrypted and protected, but we don't want to have a system that is so impenetrable that we're unable to catch child molesters, sex traffickers, people who are working through black market networks as well. And there are some constitutional concerns, as you know, and that we have to sift through. But there has been a coalescing of the minds, particularly IC heads and those of us in the legislative intelligence space, about how we can meld together and get past jurisdictional issues and bring together public health officials along with intelligence experts in sifting through these matters to prevent future pandemics to be as grave as this one has been.
I mean, this is why you're such a bad brother. You can spit hip hop lyrics and talk about national security back to back. So we appreciate your range, brother. I've always appreciated your range. Now,
thank you.
You raised the issue of the voting, and we got the congressional voting piece, and then we've got the democracy piece in the context of the upcoming general election in November. And so, like Ghostface said on the Purple Tape, when he was talking about blue and cream, let me flip it for a minute. And what are your thoughts?
The Wallaby joints, yeah.
Got to rep for the 90s, you know, 90s hip hop, y'all.
Yeah.
So what's interesting, and I want to hear your perspective on this, what's interesting is that our friends on the other side of the aisle are objecting to the notion of universal access to mail-in voting.
Wow.
I don't really understand, because if we need to socially distance in order to flatten the curve, being packed up into crowded polling sites is the exact opposite of protected public health. Do you have an explanation for why our friends on the other side of the aisle seem to object to the notion of universal mail-in voting in the November election?
My suspicions, Chairman, is that this is another form of voter suppression and fear. I would like to see it. I think that it would be a safe methodology. I think it would be a safe way. But, you know, there are others who are sowing seeds of doubt and raising the point, well, younger people have not and are not a reliable voting bloc. And so they assert that younger people, particularly younger people who tend to affiliate with the Democratic Party, won't be as enthusiastic or disciplined enough about actually sitting down and mailing in, you know, their ballot or their vote. I'd like to get your thoughts about it, but I also think my instincts tell me that this is done out of fear and a way to control the electorate. They're overestimating their ability to galvanize their voting bloc and defeat Democrats come November. But that's my sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think your instincts are right on. It's troubling. In fact, I know a few weeks ago, President Trump himself said on Trump TV that one of his typical interviews.
You already know
that you know, we can't have mail-in voting. Republicans will never win an election. Now, that's an absurd proposition.
Sure.
Mail-in voting does exist in jurisdictions where Republicans have won. This is not a partisan issue. This is a public health issue in the context of making sure that Americans can both protect themselves and exercise the franchise. And one of the things that we've fought on the battlefield together around is restoring voting rights as a precious American right. And for the life of me, I've never been able to understand why the current Republican Party has abandoned its roots in such a phenomenal way. Voting in the past was never a partisan issue until the Republicans decided that we are going to make voter suppression an electoral strategy.
Really.
You know, in 1965, you passed the Voting Rights Act. It was phenomenal. Leadership from Dr. King, and of course signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. But the Voting Rights Act has been reauthorized, I think, an additional 4 or 5 times thereafter. And every time the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized, it was signed into law by a Republican president.
Absolutely.
1970, Richard Nixon, of all people. 1975, Gerald Ford. 1982, Ronald Reagan.
Right.
2006, George W. Bush. What's wrong, y'all? I mean, this ain't a democratic thing, right? I mean, look at your own tradition. We ain't
Yeah,
asking y'all to act like Democrats, act like Republicans
that's right.
used to act in terms of voting. So we're going to have to continue to push on that piece. You know, we included 400 million for nationwide voting by mail in CARES 1. And with great leadership from Nancy Pelosi, the Congressional Black Caucus, we're going to have to push to do more in CARES 2.
I agree. And we appreciate your leadership, being at the forefront in the midst of conversations. You know, I thought my daily commitments to calls was great, but I hear you on most of those calls, and you have your own calls, as do I. But I think you have double the burden, my brother.
Yeah, well, listen, I appreciate you making yourself available. We got a couple of minutes left to chop it up. But we found that, you know, increasing our outreach through different means has been incredibly important in terms of trying to communicate with our constituents in this environment. And you've always pioneered in terms of Facebook and Instagram and you know, Twitter in terms of electronic communication and been ahead of the curve. And certainly these are vehicles that now serve us even more in terms of making sure that we check in with each other.
No doubt.
We share thoughts and ideas and perspectives. I'm interested in your views as we start the negotiations around CARES 2.0.
Yeah.
What do you think we need to do to continue to provide relief to the American people, either on the public health side or on the economic side?
That's a great question. I think on the public health side, I think we have to look at having a series of capital infusions go to places like Brooklyn, Indianapolis, the West Coast, the South, and really focus on our community health centers in a broader way. We attempted to do it with the CARES Act. I think we could expand it, and I know you've been a part of those negotiations. I would really like to see us concentrate on senior care facilities. We know that seniors are most vulnerable for contracting COVID-19. On the other side, I'd like to see our criminal justice efforts ramp up. What that looks like in terms of the negotiations you're involved with having monies go to not only the Bureau of Prisons, but to state incarceration facilities to help our prison population even flatten the curve, because they too face vulnerabilities, being that these facilities are very transient. And lastly, those small business persons who are impacted, who are self-employed, those folks who are even employing folks who are concerned about extending the Payment Protection Act from 8 weeks to maybe 16 weeks. I think those are the negotiations that progressives have to have with New Democrats, along with Republicans, in terms of making sure we're being fiscally responsible, but also making sure we aren't pinching pennies to the point that we're still hurting Americans in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely correct. This is an extraordinary moment, so it's going to require an extraordinary intervention. And a lot of the things that you laid out have to be front and center in terms of what we communicate. And we also have to look at the reality that the numbers from an unemployment standpoint continue to get worse, not better.
Absolutely.
And the longer the social distancing takes place, the more we're going to need to look at strengthening and bolstering our unemployment insurance system, perhaps beyond what we've initially done. Now, we added an additional $600 on top of what a state traditionally does to weekly unemployment insurance. We encourage everybody who's a displaced worker to take advantage of the unemployment insurance system that has been strengthened by CARES 1. But that was extended in terms of the additional $600+ through July 31st. It may be the case that we're going to have to go beyond that. We also, I know this is important to you in the city of Indianapolis, have been saying that state and local budgets have been hit hard.
Yes.
Particularly in places like New York City, New York State, which is ground zero, the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic at the moment. Cities like Indianapolis and Detroit, Chicago, other places are being hit hard or will be hit hard. And these budgets are going to be hurt. And when the budgets are hurt, it's the African American and the Latino communities, the low income communities, the traditionally disenfranchised communities that get hit even harder. I mean, you know, we talk about this a lot on the floor of the House, that if the African American community, or if America, I should say, gets a cold, we've often said the African American community gets a flu.
Hello.
Now, America is suffering from a pandemic.
Real talk.
That means that the African American community and others are being hit hard by a potential catastrophe.
Absolutely.
So we got to make sure that state and local government doesn't collapse in the midst of all of this. And that's another important piece in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. I think we've got a few questions that some folks have shouted out at us. I got my man Wayne Williams here with me. We're keeping, AKA Boy Wonder, we're keeping about 6 feet of distance. But let me see what was written out here. A question from RV8 Backseater. That's an interesting handle right there, my man. Can we ask for absentee ballots in our states? In other words, I think he is emphasizing the point that we were talking about, which is the American people should be in a position where everyone who wants to vote by absentee ballot in the context of the November election can vote by absentee ballot.
Sure.
We're not at that place right now, in part because traditionally elections, in terms of how they're being run, are being run at the state level, even in the context of federal elections.
Sure.
But the elections clause of the Constitution provides for the federal government to actually make a decision as to how federal elections are going to be run. And what we've been saying is that for purposes of the House and the Senate and the presidency, and this is a critical election, we got to make sure that everyone who wants to vote by absentee ballot can vote by absentee ballot.
I agree. What are your thoughts? Because we know we chop it up regularly, and folks don't know that we're actually neighbors. What are your thoughts about this notion that younger people are an unreliable voting bloc, and not only are they unreliable in general elections, but forget about them utilizing absentee voting?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and traditionally, based on the numbers, young people do not vote in the volume that older Americans vote in, and that's been a long-standing problem. Now, you'll see some increases from time to time. The first Obama election was an example of a significant increase in people voting, and Barack Obama, of course, you were an early supporter.
Yes,
President Obama in the Congress. I wasn't there yet. I was in the state legislature, but also endorsed him in my first year in the state legislature when he was running in 2007, 2008. And that was an inspirational campaign, and a lot of young people came out. But traditionally, you're right. Now, this should make it easier to be able to vote. But one of the things that we got to figure out is in some states, the ballots are automatically sent to every single registered voter.
Yeah.
But in other places like Ohio, you have to make the request for an absentee ballot. Now that can disenfranchise seniors and people who don't have access to the technology necessary to make the request, or to download a request form, print it out, then send it, find a stamp. And, this thing can go sideways if we don't put the guardrails in that are needed. As we approach the 30-minute hour, I want to be respectful of your time. You're working hard on behalf of the people of Indiana, so I appreciate you checking in with me, and look forward to when we're back together in DC. But we exchanged some lighter moments around our mutual love for music,
no doubt,
hip hop in particular, as we were watching the battle between the RZA and DJ Premier play itself on Saturday. So I want to get your perspective on that. Let me just say, yes, we're talking about COVID-19.
Yeah.
But music has always played a traditional role in helping us to get through tough times.
That's true.
And at this particular moment, this is a tough time for everybody. And the inspirational quality of music is certainly come to the aid and comfort of folks. And so we appreciate that. And we shared a moment as we were observing the RZA and DJ Premier going back and forth. So I'm interested in your observations of how that all went down.
Yeah, man. You know, I'm like you. I'm a big fan of Primo and RZA, and Primo was coming with the Nas. He was coming with the Biggie. RZA broke out with the Wu catalog, and I said, "Oh man, this is intense. This is intense. So many inputs, man. You know, I'm like, as soon as you start sleeping on one, the other hits you with the guillotine. You know what I mean? So it was just like, oh man. Then he broke out with the Purple Tape, RZA, and then Primo came with the 10 Crack Commandments. I'm like, oh brother, this isn't fair right here.
It was a whole nother level. And you know, it's interesting because their catalog is so long that even some of their classics didn't get dropped into the back and forth. So for instance, with Primo, he didn't drop Annie Up, right? Which is classic. You know, you go in the club and the hoodies go on, and you know it's all time.
Razor blades out, yeah, no doubt. Yeah.
You know, either get down to lay down moment. You know what I mean? Get down to lay down. And
you know,
so
there's a battle coming up this Sunday with a Hoosier and my man Teddy Riley, Babyface and Teddy Riley. You have the architect of New Jack Swing, and you have the architect of some of the greatest songwriting this country has ever produced. That's going to be dope. But people are talking about other battles, man, and but that RZA Primo, woo! I mean, that was a backpacker's heaven right there, bro.
Yeah, that was. I was waiting for RZA to drop Daytona 500. It'll be so simple, you know. But the catalog is so long. But that was a great hip hop moment. It was a great moment for all of us. You know, as people are struggling to deal with this very serious issue. So I appreciate you, brother, and appreciate the work that you're doing on behalf of the people that you represent in Indianapolis. Appreciate everybody on the check-in today on our Straight Outta Congress IG live session. Something that I think we're going to try to keep going for as long as we are operating remotely and continuing the struggle for the people.
Thank you for your leadership. Your future is bright, dear brother, and I'll be supporting you along the way.
Appreciate you, brother. Talk to you soon.
Peace. One.